So welcome back after activity 3 there. Hopefully you've assessed your team using Belbin, FiroB, Bean and Sheets, and you've looked at the roles the individuals are playing, if you've got any gaps. If there is, that's hopefully identified where you can start to try and fill those to make your team more effective. You've also looked at perhaps the role you play or may have to play if you're participative, but if you're sort of laissez-faire because you've got an experienced team, hopefully they're doing it on their own and highly effective. But hopefully you can use that to sort of evaluate and start trying to improve things and develop things. So hopefully you've got that functioning team, but we've now got to manage it. If it's working well and we know exactly what stage it has, but we also need to manage the performance, even if it's working well, to keep it engaged, to keep them motivated, and managing the performance of the individuals within that team. You may well be using coaching, as we've looked at in some of the previous units, as a method of aiding or developing those members. But as we've said, that is a tool for the moment, and here we're talking about their overall performance. So we'll be looking at some specific methods and tools, such as setting goals and objectives using SMART, reviewing performance on an ongoing sort of formal and informal basis, whether you call them reviews, supervisions. We'll be looking at absence management, and we'll also be looking at appraisals overall, and then we'll finalise by looking at how we can be constructive and positive with the feedback from that process, so that we can create an environment where development is engaging and the process is all about getting better. So let's first have a look at SMART objectives. One thing we need when we're managing performance really is some sort of goal or objective, something to be aiming for, something to set targets against. And we often hear the term, and probably have yourself, called SMART. So it's about making sure our objectives meet the criteria, and they're just coming up on the screen now. So S stands for specific. Is it simple, clear and sensible? M, measurable, meaningful, has a clear success criteria. A stands for achievable. Is it attainable? Is it possible but stretches people? R for realistic or relevant. Is it reasonable, resource and result based? And then time bound. Is it time sensitive? Is it time limited? Has it got some sort of time scale on it? So let's have a look at those individually in a little bit more detail. Let's have a look at those individually. So specific. If it's not clear and specific, you won't be able to truly focus on it or be motivated to achieve it. You won't know exactly what it is you're trying to get. When drafting an objective using SMART, you could ask yourself the 5 W's. What do you want to accomplish? Why is the goal important? Who is involved? Where is it located? Or where do I get it? And which resources or limits are involved? And with those, you might come out, for example, the specific part might be for a trainee marketing executive that we talked about before, who wants to get a permanent role, rather than just say to get a permanent role as a marketing executive, it might be to gain the skills and experience necessary to be a full-time marketing executive with their own customer portfolio. So a little bit more specific, exactly what they need. You then move on to trying to find something measurable. It's important that you can clearly measure an objective, and as it says there, you need to know what the clear success criteria will be, what will make it successful, what will it look like, and then you can track progress towards it. How can you tell if you've met a deadline, or an objective in this case, or judge that you're getting closer to it, if you don't know exactly what the measure is? In that measure, we should be looking at things like how much, how many, how will it show, what will it look like. For example, when we're talking about that marketing executive, acquiring the skills and experience necessary to become the full-time marketing executive with their own portfolio might translate into something around the fact that we need to say when they've gained the qualifications or passing an observed assessment, or when they've maintained a smaller customer portfolio to the satisfied customers, to the satisfaction of a supervisor or mentor for something where you can actually put your finger on it and say what will show that they've achieved it. And on to achievable. It needs to be obtainable for there to be any chance of it being successful. Otherwise, people just go, oh, I can't get that, I can't do that. In other words, you need to stretch them, but it needs to be within their abilities. that it can't be out of reach due to lack of opportunities, lack of availability, lack of resources, lack of time, the deadline being too tight. An achievable goal will meet questions such as, how do I accomplish this goal? How realistic is it? Are there any other constraints? Any financial resource restraints or times or factors? For example, that person we talked about who needs to gain those qualifications, if they need to get those own qualifications by paying out of their own pocket, or they've got to be done within 3 months, or they work part-time, and they're usually a full-time qualification, is it going to work? If someone's late for work regularly and you suddenly say you're never going to be late again, it's probably unachievable, especially if they get public transport to work, for example. We then move on to realistic or relevant. People use different terms for it, but basically it's around ensuring that the goal matters and that it's relevant to the person and it's realistic for them to achieve it. It needs to be that the support and assistance is there, that they have control over them, so you can make sure that everyone has considered the resources to achieve the goal. Realistic things that we should be answering and questions we will be answering ourselves is, does it seem worthwhile? Is it at the right time? Does it match other people's efforts or needs? Am I the right person to help them? Are they the right person to reach this goal? And do they or do I have the control to help them achieve it? Example, we talked about that person needing to gain the skills to become a permanent marketing executive. Well, is it the right time for them to undertake that training or work towards those qualifications, or is it too soon? Have they got the facilities? Are they the right person, and are they in a position to access the training, and do they have the free time to do it? Otherwise, it's just never going to get off the ground. It's not realistic and it's not relevant to them at the time. And finally, time bound, probably the most important, but we all need a target date to work to, something that we can focus on, something that we can work towards. We need to make sure that these things are the priority, and therefore the time bound part of it, where we're limited to, is going to set the priority as to whether it needs to get done. Can it get done in 6 months or 6 weeks, for example? And we need to make sure we think about that. But it can be revisited, so we need to make sure that we're specific, measurable, achievable, realistic or relevant, and time bound when we're setting objectives with anybody. And sometimes as the team leader, you may have to be the objective person in that they may want to do this and want to do that by this day, and you may have to say, is this realistic, and ask some of those questions. So I want to look at absence management and how we manage absence. The keys to it, the things that make a difference. I think the most important one to me is we can sort of avoid it if we engage and empower and motivate people. Well, avoid it's probably a strong word, but we can certainly cut it down and prevent it if people are engaged, they feel empowered in their role, and they're motivated to want to work for the organisation and for their team. They're less likely to take time off there. But employee absence is a significant cost on any organisation, yet research shows that a lot of employers don't really think about the cost and they don't monitor it. Employees, what we're talking about here is they may be off for a variety of reasons, from short-term sickness, it could be maternity leave, it could be public duties, it could just be not turning up for work. But again, if they're empowered, motivated, there's less chance that that'll happen. We've got a big role to play in that as a team leader, in that empowerment, that motivation part. And then also we've got a part to play in monitoring and following the policies and procedures. So we need clear policies and procedures in place. We need to be aware of them, and we need to make sure that staff are aware of them, so that they can access it, they understand what to do. For example, most people's policies will include something about if they're sick, they are to contact both manager within a certain time, and then once they've been off for a certain period of time, they will understand what their the impact is and how they will go through certain return to work interviews, for example, and certain things will trigger certain points of it, and certain points could trigger disciplinary action if things don't improve. We also need to be aware of the impact on employees' physical and emotional well-being. And what do we mean that by that? Well, we're talking about the working conditions. We're talking about the business culture, for example. Is it open and inclusive, or is it hostile and unsupportive? And that might be a reason why people aren't turning up for work or taking too much time off. What about working patterns, for example? Are there peaks and troughs in activity? Could we change shift patterns? Could we help people with sleeping patterns, etc.? Are there things we could do? And it all comes down to that physical and emotional well-being and taking a look at it and thinking about it as we go through the process. So as we said, there is about culture. It's about empowering people, engaging people and motivating people to try and mitigate the circumstances of the absence. But as we said, we do need to have clear policies and procedures to cover two areas really. These are based on the ACAS guide, which is in your resources, but the first is short term, and we need a policy in place that is clear on what employees should do if they're not coming in. So do they have to call HR? Do they have to call the manager within an hour of normal start date, for example? Start time, sorry. If the illness is going to last more than 7 days, do they have to provide a self-certificate or a fitness to work note, or do we require one of those right from the beginning? And if it's going to last more than 7 days, then they definitely will need to provide a fitness to work note from their GP. More in depth is when we go to the longer term illness. Things could be serious. I don't know, they could have been off for an operation, or they could need recovery time, or it could be a mental health problem, which has been in the news a lot recently. We require a sympathetic approach in these situations, but we've still got to have a clear policy so that if we think that it's being drawn out, that we've got a policy to follow. It's usually a matter at this stage for HR department, but we as team leaders, managers, need to be aware of what's going on so that we can make sure these things are happening. And the first thing we've got to start doing is we've got to think about whether we can manage without a replacement, or whether we need to talk to HR about someone coming in, because that's going to have a massive impact on how we manage the process. Can we manage within our other resources to cope for the period of time, which would take the pressure off that person and also make sure that we've planned for the rest of the team, because they could feel under a bit of pressure. The second is we need to maintain regular contact with the employee about their position and be clear about their sick pay, any updates, keep them appraised, example, of what's going on in the workplace as well, so that they're not disadvantaged. So if there's changes or promotions coming up, they still need to be made aware of it, because we can't be seen to have been disadvantaging these people while they're off on sick. We need to consider whether it might be best in some cases to give them the time to get better. If we want them to come back, and we want them to come back in a good, fit state to continue their role, then maybe they just need to be given the time to recover properly, rather than pressurizing and rushing them back early, which could just then exacerbate the situation. But this needs to be planned, not just done off the cuff. In that case, we need to start to make an assessment with the employee, and possibly by getting permission from them, perhaps to work with their GP or talk about it and try and work out a recovery plan. And maybe it should be phased in, maybe they come back part-time or with flexible hours at the beginning. And like I say, this may need to be in conjunction with a GP, or if you're in a large organisation, there may be company doctors that are involved. But through all that, we need to be monitoring the situation so that we're aware if any long-term issues or disabilities will continue, that we may need to put adjustments in place for their return to work. And finally, we can consider whether a return to lighter or less stressful work could be advisable. Are they going to be able to come back? Maybe part of the reason they're off is to do the role, and this will all need to be considered in the longer term process of the procedures for longer term sickness or absenteeism. And if they do return, hopefully they do, we've got some key steps that we need to follow, some actions we need to carry out, or that should be reflected in our policy for our organisation. And the first is step one, is a return to work interview. That's to welcome the employee back, to check they are well enough to resume their duties, for us to focus on why we want them back and the value to our business, and update them on any changes or anything that might have taken effect while they've been away. I know we said we keep them up to date, but it's just making sure they're aware. Step two is to take any action if required. If they've been absent repeatedly, or there's this number of return to work interviews, this isn't the first, then it's failing to result in an improvement in their attendance, and we may need to take further action. And we'll look at discipline and grievance a little bit later on in the next session, because that's what would follow. And then finally, and what I think is probably the most important is, and that gets missed, is we have a legal responsibility to protect the well-being of our employees at work. That's a duty of care, which obviously includes health and safety, but also goes beyond that. And I think the sort of things it might include are to consider physical hazards, not just the health and safety hazards, but what about, are they having enough rest breaks? Do they know how to operate their machinery? Have they been trained properly? So therefore, are there any hazards that are getting in the way, which might be leading to the sickness or the absenteeism? Are there any emotional or psychological pressures? Make sure they're not being exposed to too many causes of stress where possible. Is something happening that's causing too much of a workload? Have they got little control themselves? Is there a poor working relationships? Is there anything like bullying and harassment going on in the workplace? And we're going to talk about that specifically later. We need to be promoting awareness of health issues such as smoking, healthy diet, exercise, not taking drugs, mental health issues, all these things that may be leading to this absenteeism. And we need to, where possible, use occupational health. Where we have facilities within the organisation, we can use these to try and help people return to work, or avoid them going off work for too long. So we need to be aware of policies and procedures. We need to make sure the staff are aware and we are aware, so that we're protecting ourselves as part of people management. So it's bigger than just the policy and procedure. It's about making sure that we're protecting ourselves and them, and making sure that we have evidence that we've done everything, because if it ends up becoming a disciplinary issue or leading to a grievance, which we're going to talk about later, then we need to have the evidence to back up how we got to this situation. Next is appraisals and the appraisal process, which is a fundamental part of performance management. And the process can include a lot of pieces, but I'd just clearly like to sort of focus on what an appraisal is. Well, it's a regular record of an assessment of an employee's performance and their potential and their development needs. And the key is there's a record, so there's something formalised. It's really a roundup of an ongoing process, because this is what we're talking about, is perhaps an annual appraisal, and it's an opportunity to take an overview of all the work, the content, the loads, the quality, look back on what's been achieved against those objectives that we mentioned, those SMART objectives, and to agree some objectives for the next year. And we're going to look at different parts of this in the next sort of couple of slides. But first, there are some key points to an appraisal. So firstly, an appraisal should be an objective appraisal system. We've talked about what objective is, to review the employee's performance, their potential, and to bring a development plan. And I always say an appraisal, it's their appraisal, but it brings benefits to both the employer and the employees, because you're evaluating that job role, not just the person. You're looking at how you can improve performance, not only for that person but for the organisation, by sort of identifying strengths, weaknesses, areas for improvements, and methods of development that you might then be able to implement into other parts of the organisation or similar job roles. There needs to be a system that's clear and open, which says who will do what and when. So how will it take place? What are the criteria that we're being assessed against, and how and what will happen afterwards? Employees should see their appraisal report as something they own and something they can get involved in. Because it's not employers aren't required by law to have an appraisal system, but if it's in the terms and conditions and you said they'll get one, then it should happen. So if you stated in their employee handbook that they will get a biannual and an annual appraisal, then it should happen because part of the terms and conditions of their contract. And it can also help to fill in some of the aspects of legal employment law and legislation that we'll talk about later, but covering the fact that we've taken a duty of care because we've sat down and we've talked to them about where they're going, we've talked to them about any of their problems, can help us in that way. So we're going to start to look at that in a bit more detail, and how we can be constructive and how the process should take place. But first, I want us to look at a video which shows how easily that potential situation could become one of those difficult conversations we talked about. So watch the video about awkward build up to a performance review, and then we'll talk about delivering those performance reviews in a bit more detail.